Well, thank you very much for having me today. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is an aspect that's come out of my PhD research. My PhD was looking at how value is framed and ascribed in the vintage marketplace. One aspect that I'm kind of keen to start to tease out of that, it's in its very working stages, so be kind, is about the idea of marketplace performance, which to me really spoke to ideas of creativity. It's something that I'm hoping to develop and tease out, working with my supervisor, Paul Huer. So, vintage as a phenomenon is something that's global. You'd have to go quite far, I think, to not have seen its prominence in the past 10 years. From decades in LA to Relic in London to Brick Lane in London to the flea markets in Paris, and the quite obvious prominence of it online, and some of the kind of associations that go along with vintage as to hipster practices. Vintage seems to be everywhere, which goes back to the kind of heart of fashion that is anything really new anymore? Are we constantly just reinvigorating old styles, old habits? In the UK, these kind of turns to craft and a nostalgia of the past and aesthetics of an almost idealized past are very much at the forefront of a lot of the media discussions. So we've got Kirsty Allsop down in the bottom with her kind of handmade home, the harkening back to some practices of sewing, crafting that we've long forgotten. Into the much more commercial mainstream, thinking about Urban Outfitters, Topshop, how they've co-opted this idea of vintage. If you have some time, if you're in London for a while, Oxford Street, the huge Topshop flagship store, the bottom of it has its vintage basement, where you can shop for vintage but in very familiar surroundings. So it's merchandised in the Topshop way, you can try it on, it's clearly got a price attached to it, there's no haggling involved that you might associate with vintage. To me, 3 years ago when I was starting my PhD, I saw that vintage was everywhere, but it seemed like there was something perhaps maybe more complex going on with it. I wanted to understand how vintage was materialized in the marketplace. It seems as if vintage as a word is something that we throw about quite easily without any anchoring or stability to it. Unlike antiques, which we can frame in regard to the time period that they've been around and the value that's associated with it, vintage is very subjective. It lacks that categorization that we have with antiques. Some people argue that it's age dependent, so one person's vintage is not necessarily another person's vintage, and they might have lived through that period, not necessarily associate the 90s as vintage. But there seems to be some sort of fluidity attached to it, which for me in the idea of creativity and value creation, I thought there was perhaps something interesting going on. One thing that I started to think about was the very basic tenet. Who decides something is vintage? How do you make sense of it? One person's vintage is another person's dead cast off. So it's the kind of proverbial tree in the forest almost, as without an audience, does vintage actually exist? That got me thinking about some of the work that I'd read by Gregson and Crew, who are coming from a human geography perspective, where they talk about the marketplace needing a knowing audience. So to enable interpretation and sense making, you need to have an audience that understands where you're coming from, which I thought was a useful place to start. The idea of second-hand markets is not something new in consumer history. As long as there's been objects in the marketplace, there's been trading of those objects. So we've had it in CCT thinking about flea markets, thinking about thrift shopping, and then the obvious spaces of alternative consumption, which I would very strongly argue vintage is. I'm approaching vintage as a social and cultural construct. It is something that needs the collective effort involved in order to unpack it and in order to realise the inherent value in it. For the purposes of my PhD, I was looking at vintage with a practice orientation. So thinking about the circuit of practice, thinking about the objects, doings, and meanings in the marketplace and how they relate to vintage. I really like this idea from Maguda about the socio-material context of where these embodied activities happen. So one thing I would argue that came out of my PhD is the idea that we talk about practice around objects, doings, meanings, but the context and the spatializing element of that is somewhat overlooked. Moving this forward to thinking about the marketplace, my research has been around the pop-up markets that happen at weekends, on quiet Sunday afternoons. They take over unused spaces such as church halls, pubs, abandoned cinemas. Straight away, there's some sort of creativity happening there in that they can see a value and a use in these spaces. But as a marketplace, it is ephemeral, it's transient. It is very much based around the idea that if you don't know about it, you can't necessarily access it. There's a big dialogue that happens online around these marketplaces, which to me started to speak to ideas of consumer tribes and having to be in the know to be able to actually access them. The research that I've done was over 3 years at these marketplaces in Scotland, and this is an image which I really liked. It's the kind of Le Feur's Parisian balcony where you get to look down at everybody as they're constructing the marketplace. For me, it was an act of creativity from its very beginning, in that they arrive at this marketplace if you're a seller, and you're given a bench, perhaps a wooden table, and from that you have to create vintage. You have to create your seller identity and how you're going to attract people to your stall, and also to create ideas of value. So this t-shirt that you have, through the styling perhaps, through negotiations of that space, how do you create your space as an inviting area that consumers actually want to come into and to purchase something that to all intents and purposes is a used good? Thinking about it from a consumer perspective, one of the things that came out of the data really early on was about this idea of the eye, the skill that was involved in vintage, that it wasn't something that everybody could access. I like this quote because Elena really highlights the idea that some people would walk past it, they don't see any latent value in it. For her, she's able to actually access something about it. And she likes the idea that she's giving this object another chance at life. That's how she thinks about it. In the marketplace, there was a lot of performance at a very basic level that was happening. Both consumers and sellers, which I would refer to as practitioners in action, dress a certain way, they behave a certain way. It becomes this tribal space where accepted modes of belonging are performed. Some of the data I have from respondents, they spoke about if they dressed a certain way, they felt they belonged more. So to me, that spoke of practices of belonging. But they also spoke about it in terms of if they dressed a certain way, they were charged a different price. Value in the marketplace was something that was up for grabs. It was a constant negotiation between buyer and seller, and whether you looked as if you fitted in or not affected that. This idea then led me to think about, does vintage just act then as a brand name? Which I think is an interesting irony, because obviously it exists in this space that's not quite the commercial mainstream, but it's not quite alternative since it's been co-opted. But what actually is vintage? Does it function like a brand name where it allows categorization of the object? So kind of tying into Don Slater's work, that allows for the marketplace to happen. Or is there something more complex going on with the branding there? From a seller perspective, performance was huge. You have all these characters that are allowed to really be creative with their personalities and to cultivate certain personas in the marketplace, which really helped their selling. To me, this struck me as kind of Goffman's notions of everybody's always self-consciously playing a role, but the idea that it actually affected value, I think, is something that's quite tangible in the marketplace. Gillian highlights the idea of something becoming vintage, so a transformation in the journey of that object. Vintage, to all intents and purposes, is an object that's been around, it's had its consumption trajectory, it's been removed, it's maybe existed on the peripheries of somebody's life, in a garage, in a basement somewhere, but it's being re-entered. So how is it materialised into action? She speaks about it in terms of judgment, in terms of skill, which to me spoke of the aesthetic labour, firstly, that was involved in that, but also the kind of Bourdieu, Joanna Entwistle notions of aesthetic capital. And you actually literally wear your capital with vintage. Michael is one of the most prevalent sellers in the marketplace that I encountered, but he really spoke about it in terms of vintage is just part of the marketplace. It's a stylisation of second-hand. It means we can charge more. I thought that was interesting. I thought it was quite a kind of blatant, vintage is something I use, it means I can get more money for my products. Teasing it out a bit from him, he spoke about almost being a gatekeeper in the marketplace. So the knowledge that he had, whether objects would be re-entered or not, was down to decisions that he made. So I think there is something more complex going on there, even than he is aware of. I'll just finish up here. I started to tease out this notion of performance, and I really arrived at it in the vintage marketplace as a creative act, as something that's socially and culturally produced. It's something that is learned over time. So the people speaking about skill, knowledge, harnessing their creativity, it wasn't something that had come to them since vintage became more prevalent. It was a skill that had been practiced all through their childhoods, through their consumer histories. It was a way of seeing the world. In that way, it was very much an apprenticeship, almost, as a consumer, in that it was practiced over a lifetime, and the marketplace allowed a space for that. So the idea of spatialities is something that I'm keen to work on and develop alongside this idea of performance, that if these kind of ad hoc marketplaces provide a safe space, a space for belonging, and a space for us to trial more episodic selves in line with Stafford. They also, in relation to the more commercial mainstream, are spaces of character and texture where value and creativity are prized above all. Thank you very much. Any questions? Okay.
What really struck me here, and it's maybe not the direction you were thinking of at all, but the parallels between talking about vintage clothing and how that presents selected a lot of places, etc., vintage generally, and actually how social networking works, where you're basically picking up material already produced and used, and you're repurposing it, putting it together with other material to make a sort of complete picture of yourself. And is that a sort of parallel that's occurred to you, or maybe you don't think it's valid?
No, I do think I think it's a really interesting parallel. I think in some ways vintage exists as a kind of ultimate form of bricolage in that way, where you're combining old with new and repurposing and re-enchanting and giving it a new life. Which I think it's actually really interesting how that happens in the digital sphere. There's a lot of organisations coming to light now that are kind of the vintage of Net-a-Porter, Vestiaire Collective, and some of these sites where it's all happening in the digital domain. And part of my research that I've done is looking at the digital identities of these people in the marketplace. So how do they create their persona as the gatekeeper through their digital presence on Facebook and on Twitter, and how that reaffirms their kind of positioning in the marketplace. So I do think there's a huge tie-in between the two. Hi.
I had a question which sort of relates to Charles' earlier presentation, where he shows that he called it the firm and the consumer. When it comes to a haircut, there's mostly the firm being created in the co-creation, and then on the inside will be different. How would that work in the vintage marketplace? I mean, you have a seller and buyer. Who is creating more? Or is that even possible to distinguish?
In my study, I didn't distinguish between buyer and seller. I referred to them as practitioners purely because they both bought and sold. So there are these kind of roles that are adopted in moments of time, but they're not bound by their role as either buyer or seller. Quite frequently in the marketplace, with people that have made their profit, they straight away go and buy something else. Consumers spoke of adopting the role of seller when necessary, so kind of going back to the eBayification from Dennery, Knott and Molesworth work about the eBayification and seeing wardrobes as stockpiles. I think it's difficult then to really negotiate and tease out who is creating more and what you actually term as creating in that marketplace.
They play the role within a particular time of the overall.
Which I think goes back to the ideas of space and context, and that you can't discuss the practices without actually contextualizing them.
I think it also goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about the different, do we need to define different roles? Because if, every single entity is going to, at one point, be the actor or the audience or the affordance and so on, then you don't need these different roles. Yeah. So I think that's important.
The fluidity.
Hi. Something occurred to me that a previous speaker, we talked about the American teenagers not really understanding the language of selling out. And possibly there's a generational issue there. But they certainly do understand the concept of selling in. And this is, I think, an interesting reflection upon the debate about co-optation or belonging to one view of how markets are done. Really, it's not that interesting. In particular, when you look at this particular context, you can see that the idea of selling out isn't really what it's about. You can't take these big stances against issues in that way, but you can use the ideas of these issues in a creative way. And I think this study helps us in a very subtle way understand the material practices of work, and it also reflects back, I think, interestingly, on the previous presentation where we were all getting tangled in knots about the consumption and production. Well, we never used the language of production because we daren't use production. Every act of creativity is an act of consumption. Every act of consumption is an act of creativity. We're talking about production, but we don't want to use that language because that kind of gets us back to old scenes. So I love the idea.
Thank you. I really like the selling in. I think it's really interesting in talking to people, especially talking to a wide range of people over 3 years, the people that have been doing this for forever. They don't see what they do as vintage. This is what they've always done, and it's the marketplace has actually categorized that and put that name on it. And they're kind of like, well, for me, vintage was cars and guitars and wine, and that's not what I do. But okay, if it means I can charge more or it helps people understand it, then I could go with that. And it's kind of negotiating these principles that they have, that they believe about consuming in a different way, that they offer a space of the alternative, where actually this kind of co-optation and popularisation is allowing the marketplace to flourish, and by proxy them to flourish. So I think it's really interesting, but thank you.
Yeah, but the other interesting point is that we're reinventing marketing language in the 1970s. Well, but you guys probably
That's
weren't around in the 1970s.
Vintage in action.
Selling in. Selling in was the big issue.
Vintage marketing.
Okay.
Thank you very much.